What I'd like to discuss today is creating polygon primitives and then some basic manipulation of the components of those primitives as the basis for modeling, polygon modeling in Maya. So just like if you are going to generate a 3D form in the real world and take a piece of clay and transform it from a block into something more intricate and unique, like some kind of ceramic vessel, you need some material to start with. And so you add that material by adding a polygon primitive. So on the poly modeling shelf here, I'm under my modeling toolkit, or my modeling menu set here, and we have a number of really basic forms that we can choose to add to our scene. I almost always, if I'm modeling something complex, start with a cube. It is the most basic form, and when I just go ahead and click that cube, it pops up in the origin of my viewport here. It's the most basic kind of polygon component, and that's because it's generated of 4 sides. All polygon models want to have 4 faces, and we just make more and more kind of faces, but they all are generally 4 sides. For example, even in this sphere here, this polygon model has the faces are all 4-sided. But this is a more complex polygon primitive, but its basic components and flow are really similar to this cube in that we have, so this is the most basic kind of form. And so I really do recommend starting with a cube rather than a sphere. Move this out of the way a bit. Whenever we generate a polygon primitive, and we also have other options, we have these like most popular poly primitives to start with, or we can go to our create poly primitives, and there's even more options here for different poly primitives. When we create that poly primitive, it's creating it based on the options here that are set by default, or that you've specified here under the options. So for example, under my polycube options right now, by default, it's going to create a polygon cube that has width, height, and depth of 1, and then divisions that are 1 as well. And that's how we result in this kind of square. If I change this to 2, 2, 2 with 2 divisions as my default, I'm going to say create. And now you see I've created a cube that has different default settings. So it has subdivisions for each face, 2 on each edge. So we've divided by 2 each of these faces, and we've also increased its size. We are able to, and so if I want to, then every time I go to create a cube now, it will inherit those properties. So I might want to go back to my poly primitive cube options here and just say edit reset settings, and that will reset it to the default. And then I just say apply, close, and then I can delete that got created there. Okay, so some of those same parameters are also, we can find those properties here under a third. There's 5 nodes that get created with any poly primitive. And the third one here, which is polycube, well, let me go through the list here. This first one is our general transform information. It's kind of global position, rotation, and scale. And then some other information that we don't need to necessarily worry about. Embedded in this first node, it just says this is a Maya object, and here's its location and rotation and translation, basically all its transform properties. Okay, then we have that it's a p-cube shape. So then this is another node that contains a lot of information that says that this is a polygon shape. Then our third node here says this is a polygon primitive, and we can then adjust some of those default settings here. So I'm able to add divisions really easily in this node and change these attributes here. So rather than changing them up in the options, I can change them directly locally for this one particular object. And then we have our shading group, meaning that it has a material shader attached to it, and then the surface material is this Lambert one, which is the default, which we'll then change those as we go. Okay, so some of the this particular object breaks down into different components. So if I right click over the object right now, by default, I'm in object mode, but this object is made up of vertices. And so if I go to vertex mode, I'm able to select individual vertex points. And these points in space really they're the basis for the entire poly model. Like, where do these points exist? And then those points resolve into edges that you can select and manipulate edges. Those edges resolve into faces. So when we're modeling, we're going to be working in these different component modes and then and then performing operations on those particular modes to transform this polygon primitive into a more complex and recognizable object.